Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. But this story doesn't begin with a signature on a heavy piece of parchment, nor does it begin with the grand, echoing vows of a wedding chapel filled with familiar faces. It begins in a silent steel-paneled elevator, rising too fast above the gray streets of Manhattan, pulling me away from the only life I had ever known. The air pressure shifted in my ears, a subtle, physical popping sensation that mirrored the sudden, violent uprooting of my reality. Beside me stood Julian Sterling, the man who had just purchased my future. He was a towering figure of winter stone and dark, immaculate tailoring. There were no ostentatious watches catching the overhead light, no diamond cufflinks flashing at his wrists. There was just the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who owned the very air he breathed, radiating a coldness that seeped through the thick wool of his coat and settled into my bones. My name is Clara Vance, and until this morning, my life had been measured in thread counts, calloused fingertips, and the quiet hum of a neighborhood that knew my face. Now, I was a line item in a corporate acquisition. My brother Arthur had gambled away more than just money. He had gambled away my autonomy. The ledgers he left behind were deep, black voids of debt that threatened to swallow our family name entirely, leaving me as the only viable collateral to appease the creditors closing in on our doorstep. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Arthur had simply finished the job our father started, spiraling into a desperate underworld of loans that demanded blood or gold. The men who came to our door did not care that I was a simple artisan, nor did they care that our mother had passed away in the very room they threatened to empty. They only cared about the numbers on the ledger. And so the transaction was meticulously drafted, reviewed by silent lawyers in glass rooms, and executed without a single drop of emotion. A massive debt was erased, and a bride was quietly acquired to serve whatever social or corporate optics Julian required to secure his empire. The paperwork did not mention love, or comfort, or even basic kindness. It only required my physical presence. The elevator chimed, a soft synthetic note that felt entirely out of place in the suffocating quiet, and the heavy doors slid open. Julian's penthouse was vast, opening up into a sprawling expanse of sterile luxury. It was a cold landscape of polished gray marble, floor-to-ceiling glass that let in the overcast afternoon light, and sharp geometric furniture that looked more like modern art exhibits than places meant for human rest. The climate-controlled air smelled faintly of ozone, industrial cleaners, and expensive emptiness. It was the scent of absolute isolation. There were no framed photographs on the walls to document a lived history, no books left open on a side table to suggest a moment of leisure, no scuff marks on the immaculate floorboards to prove that someone actually breathed in this space. The silence had teeth, biting into my skin and reminding me of my sheer vulnerability. It was not a home by any definition I understood. It was a gilded vault floating above the clouds, a fortress designed to keep the world out while trapping me inside. I was Julian's newest, most reluctant acquisition, a living statue meant to occupy his empty halls. Julian stepped out first, expecting me to follow the invisible, authoritative path he carved through the silence. He stopped halfway down the corridor, turning back to face me. "The master suite is at the end of the hall," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate against the cold glass windows, devoid of any warmth or welcome. "Your belongings can be brought up later by the staff. You should rest." I did not nod in agreement. I did not look toward the grand double doors he indicated at the end of the sprawling corridor, where heavy velvet drapery framed a room built for kings. Instead, I tightened my grip on the thick canvas straps of my duffel bag and shifted the massive weight of the item in my other hand. It was my worn sewing machine, a relic from a time before Arthur's gambling had destroyed our peace. The black, cast-iron base was freezing against my palm, its familiar, comforting smell of mechanical oil and old metal, serving as my only tether to reality in this museum of wealth. My arm ached fiercely from carrying it, the muscles in my shoulder burning under the strain. But I had flatly refused to let Julian's white-gloved driver touch it in the lobby. It belonged to me. It was the tool of my trade, the instrument of my independence, and I would not surrender it to the pristine hands of his employees. I would rather my muscles tear than let him buy my comfort. I walked past him without a word. I ignored the sprawling master bedroom entirely, turning instead toward a narrow, secondary hallway that branched off toward the rear of the apartment, far away from his personal quarters. I pushed open a door at random and found a small, unadorned guest room. It held a simple, low-profile bed, a blank white wall, and a wide window overlooking the relentless rain-streaked skyline. It was empty. It was perfect. I walked into the corner of the room and carefully set the heavy iron machine onto the floorboards. The dull, heavy thud reverberated through the quiet space, a definitive sound that staked my claim on this tiny fraction of his empire. Then, I turned back to the hallway, retrieved the rest of my meager belongings from near the elevator bank, and carried in a simple, worn wooden chair I had brought all the way from my childhood home. The wood was darkened by years of daily use, the seat worn perfectly smooth by countless hours of labor, under the glow of a single incandescent bulb. I placed the worn wooden chair directly in the center of the bare guest room. I pressed both of my palms flat against the top of the backrest and leaned my entire weight forward, pushing down aggressively into the joints. I shifted left, then right. It did not wobble in the slightest. It did not creak. The old wooden dowels held firm, resisting the downward pressure, just as they had for over a decade of my life. This chair had sat in the corner of my mother's small bedroom. It was where I had spent countless nights, sewing by lamplight while she coughed into a handkerchief, where I had desperately tried to stitch our fraying lives back together. It was structurally sound. It was a practical workspace built for labor, not a gilded cage meant for a decorative wife. Satisfied that it had survived the transit, I released my grip on the oak and let out a slow, steady exhale, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. Here, in this tiny square of space, I was still Clara. When I turned around, Julian was standing silently in the doorway. His dark eyes tracked my deliberate movements, his expression a mask of impenetrable stoicism. He did not ask why I had rejected the master suite. He did not demand that I take my place in his opulent, king-sized bed. Nor did he lecture me on the disrespect of claiming the servant-like quarters of his home. He simply watched me, a silent, towering observer trying to decipher a behavioral language he had never been taught in his world of easy compliance. His hands were clasped loosely behind his back, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sterile light of the hallway, yet he made no move to cross the threshold into the room I had chosen. The silence between us was heavy, laced with a strange, unspoken tension that neither of us was willing to break. I walked past him again, moving out of the guest room and into the vast, echoing expanse of the open-concept kitchen. The center island was a massive, uninterrupted slab of gray-veined marble, polished to a mirror shine and completely bare of any human touch. It looked more like an altar than a place to prepare a warm meal. I reached deep into my canvas tote bag, my fingers brushing past spools of thread until I found what I was looking for. I withdrew my personal cup. It was a chipped wooden mug, stained dark and uneven on the inside, from years of brewing strong black tea, dried peppermint, and chamomile. I held it in both hands for a moment, letting my thumbs trace the familiar, rough texture of the splintered rim. This mug had sat beside my mother's bed for years. It was a small, stubborn piece of my true home. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, I set the mug down directly, in the center of the immaculate marble counter. The hollow wooden clack it made was sharp, dull, and utterly foreign in this environment of glass and steel. It sat there, an ugly, worn, heavily used object, fundamentally ruining the perfect, sterile aesthetic of his high society world. It was a quiet rebellion, a physical marker of my boundaries. I would occupy the space he had purchased to house me, but I would not be absorbed by it. I would not become another polished, empty fixture in his collection. The afternoon stretched out into a quiet, oppressive gray. The rain began to fall harder against the massive glass panes of the penthouse, silent and persistent, blurring the sharp, aggressive edges of the city skyscrapers below into soft smudges of charcoal. The storm outside mirrored the turbulent chaos that had led me to this room, but inside, I forced a profound, unbroken stillness. I remained isolated in the small guest room, sitting on the floor as I methodically unpacked the tools of my livelihood. My botanical embroidery kit sat open on the pale rug, a chaotic but fiercely familiar array of colorful silk threads, traditional steel needles, and small, tightening wooden hoops. Each spool of thread was a memory, a testament to the thousands of hours I had spent perfecting a craft that Arthur had so carelessly endangered. I traced the smooth wood of my hoops, feeling a wave of fierce protectiveness wash over me. This was how I would survive the duration of this arrangement. This was how I would ensure that my soul remained entirely my own, even if my legal signature now belonged to Julian's estate. The muted sound of hard leather shoes stepping against the hallway floorboards broke my deep concentration. I did not look up immediately, keeping my eyes fixed on sorting my green threads, letting the heavy footsteps come to a gradual halt just outside the open door of my room. He stepped inside, crossing the threshold of my claimed territory, bringing the scent of cold rain, cedarwood, and expensive wool with him. In his right hand, Julian held a small, sleek black object, and draped meticulously over his left arm was a series of heavy, opaque garment bags. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that belonged to a predator, stopping a few feet away from where I sat. He laid the garment bags carefully over the edge of the simple guest bed. They rustled softly, emitting the faint, suffocating scents of expensive, dry-cleaning chemicals and new stiff leather. "For the upcoming social engagements," Julian said, his voice devoid of any inflection, stating a fact rather than making a request. "You will need a proper wardrobe. The staff has already stocked the master closet. But I had these brought up immediately. And this." He stepped toward a small glass side table, positioned near the large window, and set down an unlimited black-tier credit card. It landed against the glass with a sharp, definitive click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. The card was unnaturally heavy, forged from cold metal and sleek, matte plastic. An object that held enough immediate financial power to buy and sell the entire working-class street I had grown up on without a second thought. It was the ultimate undeniable symbol of his control, offered smoothly under the guise of husbandly provision. I stared at the heavy card resting on the glass. I looked over at the dark, suffocating bags pooling on the bed. They were not gifts meant to bring me joy. They were a uniform. They were the required costume of a purchased asset, a highly calculated way to mold me into a silent, glittering, acceptable accessory to drape over his arm during society dinners and board meetings. Accepting them meant accepting my status as property. I turned away from the table without saying a word. Reaching into the depths of my botanical embroidery kit, I pulled out a large, neatly folded square of raw, unbleached linen. The fabric was exceptionally coarse and earthy, smelling faintly of dried grass, dust, and raw nature. It was the complete antithesis to the sterile, synthetic perfection of the penthouse. I laid it out flat on my lap, smoothing my palms over the rough fibers, grounding myself in its unyielding texture. I was preparing to start a new, complex botanical embroidery pattern, a sprawling, intricate design of climbing ferns and delicate lavender sprigs that I intended to sell to Martha Finch's small, independent craft shop back in the city. Martha was the only person who knew the truth of my sudden marriage, and she had promised to keep buying my work so I could maintain my own private ledger. To begin the foundational work, I needed to fold the edge over and press a sharp, perfectly straight crease into the hem before pinning it. Usually, I used a specialized bone folder, or the smooth edge of an old wooden ruler to score the fabric. Today, neither was within my immediate reach. I stood up slowly, holding the large square of raw linen in my left hand, and walked deliberately over to the glass table. Julian's dark eyes followed me, calculating, perhaps expecting me to finally yield, to slip the heavy black card into my pocket, with a murmur of forced transactional gratitude. Instead, I picked up the heavy metal card between my thumb and forefinger. It was freezing to the touch. It felt impossibly heavy with unearned privilege and the weight of a world I despised, a physical manifestation of the chains he had wrapped around my wrists. I walked calmly back to my faithful wooden seat and sat down. I folded the rough edge of the linen over, creating a precise, half-inch hem. Then, I placed the fabric flat across my knee, pressed the sharp, perfectly engineered edge of the black-tier credit card hard against the fold, and dragged it aggressively down the entire length of the fabric. The resulting sound was grating and loud, a sharp, scratching rasp of hard, expensive plastic, tearing against coarse, unyielding natural fibers. I pressed down even harder on the second pass, using the physical weight of his vast, untouchable corporate fortune, simply to flatten a stubborn piece of ordinary cloth. I dragged it back up, then down again, leaning my shoulder into the motion, and Shrinking's crease was sharp, permanent, and perfectly straight. The card, designed to open any door in the world and summon unimaginable luxuries, was reduced to a crude, rudimentary tool in my hands. It was the only use I would ever find for Julian's money. I did not want his cars, his mansions, or the cold, hollow prestige of his family name. When I was entirely satisfied with the state of the hem, I stood up, walked back across the room to the glass table, and dropped the card exactly where he had left it. It landed with a dull clatter, the sleek surface now marred by the friction of my work. "I don't need this," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, refusing to let even a micro-tremor of anger or intimidation bleed into the quiet, heavy space between us. "And I won't be wearing those." I gestured with a slight flick of my chin toward the dark garment bag sullying the bed. "I have my own clothes, and I have my own work to support myself." Julian stood perfectly still in the center of the room. He did not raise his voice to assert his dominance. He did not lecture me on the rigid expectations of high society. Nor did he cruelly remind me of the millions of dollars he had just spent to clear Arthur's disastrous ledgers. He simply looked down at the black card, its pristine, matte surface now faintly dusted, with microscopic, rough fibers of raw linen, and then he slowly looked back up at me. His expression remained an unreadable, towering fortress of cold restraint, but in the micro-tension of his squared jaw, in the sudden, absolute stillness of his posture, something elemental shifted in the room. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I did not shrink under his intense, assessing gaze. I did not drop my eyes to the floor, and I did not offer a single word of apology for my defiance. I simply turned my back to him, sat down comfortably in my familiar timber chair, and picked up my steel needle. I had drawn my boundary, and I would not be the one to step back. I threaded a long, vibrant strand of deep green silk through the narrow eye of the needle, my hands perfectly steady. Our true worth is reclaimed the moment we refuse to disappear for others. I pulled the silk thread taut, anchored the small knot securely at the back of the coarse fabric, and pushed the sharp point through the linen. The quiet, rhythmic sound of the needle piercing the cloth filled the room, replacing the heavy silence with a steady, metronomic heartbeat of absolute independence. I felt his massive presence linger in the doorway for a long, heavy moment. Julian was a man accustomed to buying compliance, a man whose entire world operated flawlessly on the cold, predictable mathematics of leverage, debt, and submission. But as I drew the green silk thread smoothly through the rough linen, refusing to even acknowledge the staggering wealth he had laid at my feet, I knew he was beginning to realize the absolute truth of our arrangement. He had bought my signature to settle a ledger, but he could not buy my hands, and he would never own my soul. The first week of my new existence moved with the agonizing, glacial pace of a deeply held breath. Time in the penthouse did not pass. It simply accumulated in heavy, silent layers, settling over the polished marble and sharp glass like invisible dust. I rarely saw the man who had purchased my future. He left, long before the pale morning light managed to pierce the thick layer of clouds over Manhattan, and he returned long after the city had dissolved into a sea of artificial, glittering constellations. We existed in the same sprawling, sterile space, yet we moved in completely separate orbits. I kept strictly to the small guest room I had claimed on the very first day. It was my sanctuary, a tiny, defiant perimeter where I was not collateral, not a newly acquired asset, and certainly not a high society wife. I was simply an artisan with a quota to meet. Martha Finch had sent a message through a courier on Tuesday, confirming that her independent shop was running dangerously low on my custom pieces. The modest income I earned from her orders was my only true lifeline, the sole remaining proof that I belonged to myself. I spent my days seated in my hand-carved seat, hunched over my botanical embroidery kit, letting the rhythmic, familiar bite of the steel needle ground me in a reality that felt increasingly unmoored. I refused to touch the unlimited black card resting on the glass side table. I refused to open the garment bags that still hung in the closet like dark, suffocating ghosts. I lived entirely out of my single canvas duffel, wearing my own simple cotton sweaters and faded denim, stubbornly preserving the boundaries I had drawn on that very first afternoon. It was nearly 2 in the morning, when the quiet routine of my isolation was finally broken. A relentless freezing rain had been battering the massive windows of the apartment for hours, blurring the city lights into a smeared, melancholic canvas of gray and gold. My eyes were burning with a dull, persistent ache from staring at the microscopic weave of a raw linen square, the harsh glare of the small desk lamp, offering no comfort. I needed a glass of water. Pushing myself up from the oak seat, I massaged the stiff, tight muscles at the base of my neck and padded softly down the long, shadowed corridor toward the sprawling open-concept kitchen. The living area was completely dark, save for the ambient glow of the street lamps far below. I moved quietly, intending to slip in and out without disturbing the absolute stillness of the estate. But as I passed a sharp, geometric armchair positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows, my peripheral vision caught a heavy, irregular shadow disrupting the pristine lines of the furniture. I stopped, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. Draped haphazardly over the steel backrest was a thick, dark garment. I stepped closer, my quiet footsteps muffled by the cold floorboards. It was Julian's worn wool coat. I stood beside the chair, looking down at the heavy fabric. In a home where everything was flawlessly engineered, obsessively polished, and aggressively modern, this coat was a glaring anomaly. It was deeply, undeniably imperfect. The charcoal wool was dense and incredibly heavy, but the edges of the cuffs were slightly frayed. It carried the faint, lingering scent of his signature cedarwood, mixed with the sharp, metallic bite of the winter rain. But what caught my attention, what arrested the trained eye of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding the language of textiles, was the inner lining. The dark navy silk had torn violently near the left shoulder seam, the delicate fabric giving way under the strain of the heavy outer wool. The raw, jagged edges of the tier exposed the internal structuring of the garment, a hidden vulnerability masked by a formidable exterior. I reached out, my fingertips brushing against the cold, damp wool. I was not his wife in any meaningful sense. I was not obligated to perform the domestic duties of a spouse who cared for her partner's belongings. I was a transaction, a ledger balanced by my physical presence. But I was also an artisan. I belonged to a long lineage of women who believed that a well-made thing deserved to be maintained, that a tear was not a reason for discard, but an opportunity for quiet restoration. Leaving it jagged and fraying felt like a betrayal of the craft itself. Without entirely thinking through the implications of my actions, I gathered the heavy coat in my arms. It felt like carrying a suit of armor. I carried it silently down the hall, back into the dim sanctuary of my small room, and draped it carefully over the back of that worn wooden chair. I sat down, pulling the torn shoulder onto my lap. I reached into my supplies, bypassing the vibrant greens and deep lavenders I usually used for my botanical patterns, and extracted a spool of heavy, midnight blue silk thread. It was a perfect, seamless match for the torn lining. I threaded my needle with practiced, automatic precision, tied a microscopic knot at the end of the silk, and began to work. The silence of the room narrowed down to the tiny metallic whisper of the needle piercing the silk. I worked slowly, using a tight, invisible slip stitch to draw the frayed edges of the lining back together. The coat was incredibly heavy across my knees, a physical reminder of the man who wore it, a man whose entire existence was built on absolute control and impenetrable walls. As I pulled the thread taut, closing the gap in the fabric, I found myself wondering why a billionaire with endless resources would continue to wear a garment that was quietly falling apart from the inside. He could have replaced it 1,000 times over with a single dismissive phone call. Yet, he kept this one. He wore it into the storm. It was a small, perplexing contradiction in a man who otherwise seemed completely devoid of sentiment. I was halfway through the repair, my focus entirely consumed by the tension of the silk thread, when the faint sound of a footstep registered over the drumming rain. I froze. The needle stopped halfway through the fabric. I did not turn around immediately, but the sudden shift in the air pressure, the subtle deepening of the shadows at the edge of my vision, told me I was no longer alone. He was standing in the doorway. My heart executed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I braced myself for the cold reprimand, for the arrogant assumption that I was finally acting like a subservient, domesticated asset eager to please the master of the house. I tightened my grip on the heavy wool, my jaw setting into a hard, defensive line as I finally turned my head to look at him. Julian stood silently at the threshold. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the tense, corded muscles beneath his skin. He looked exhausted. The usual sharp, impenetrable mask he wore for the corporate world had slipped just a fraction, revealing the deep, shadowed fatigue beneath his dark eyes. He looked down at the heavy coat resting across my lap, then at the glint of the steel needle pinched between my fingers. He did not speak. He did not ask what I was doing, nor did he demand an explanation for why I had taken his property into my private space. For a long, excruciating moment, he simply watched me, his gaze dropping to the precise, invisible stitches I had woven into the torn silk. The silence between us stretched, heavy and vibrating, with unspoken words. Then, without a single sound, he turned and disappeared back down the dark hallway. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I resumed my work. I told myself his silent departure was merely indifference. I pulled the thread through the fabric again, determined to finish the seam and leave the coat outside his door before morning. 5 minutes later, the soft tread of his footsteps returned. I stiffened as his towering frame stepped entirely into the small guest room. Crossing the invisible boundary I had drawn on my first day, I refused to look up, keeping my eyes stubbornly fixed on the torn lining, my needle moving with forced, mechanical precision. He walked slowly toward my small desk, the faint scent of cedarwood wrapped around me, accompanied by a new, startlingly warm aroma. He reached out and set a ceramic mug down on the edge of my desk, just inches from my elbow. Steam curled upward in the chilly air, carrying the distinct, soothing fragrance of fresh chamomile and dried peppermint. It was the exact blend I drank. He must have noticed the remnants in my chipped wooden cup, left on the kitchen counter days ago. I stopped sewing, staring at the rising steam in absolute shock. I opened my mouth to speak, to reject the offering, to tell him I did not need his manufactured kindness to survive this arrangement. But before I could form a single syllable, he moved closer. He leaned over my shoulder. He was so close I could feel the ambient heat radiating from his chest, a stark contrast to the freezing draft bleeding through the window panes. He did not touch me. He did not crowd my space with arrogance. Instead, he reached past me, his large hand gently grasping the brass neck of my small sewing lamp. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tilted the lampshade exactly 2 inches to the left. The harsh, blinding glare that had been bouncing off the glossy silk threads and burning into my retinas instantly vanished. The light shifted, casting a soft, perfect illumination directly onto the torn seam of the coat without reflecting back into my tired eyes. It was a microscopic adjustment. It was an act of profound, hyper-observant care that required no money, no leverage, and no corporate authority. Julian released the brass neck of the lamp. He stepped back, restoring the physical distance between us, and looked down at me. "The glare," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely broke the silence of the room. "It will ruin your eyes." He did not wait for a thank you. He did not linger to admire his own magnanimity, or wait for me to acknowledge the hot tea he had brewed in the dead of night. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps fading into the cavernous depths of the penthouse, leaving me entirely alone with the warmth of the ceramic mug and the perfectly adjusted light. I sat frozen in my worn wooden chair, for a very long time, the heavy coat resting over my knees. I looked at the tea, then at the lamp, and finally at the tiny, perfect stitches binding the torn silk together. Sometimes love doesn't knock. It waits. I was far from feeling anything resembling love for the man who had bought my signature. But as I picked up the needle to finish the final inch of the seam, the heavy, suffocating anger in my chest had cracked. Just a little, just enough to let the light in. The quiet reverberations of that night lingered in the air for the next few days, altering the atmospheric pressure of the penthouse. We did not spikes of the mended coat, nor did we mention the tea. But the silence between us had shifted. It was no longer the teeth-baring, defensive quiet of a hostage and a captor. It was a cautious, observant stillness. I began to venture slightly further out of my room, exploring the vast, empty halls of the estate, while he was away at his corporate headquarters, searching for pieces of the man who hid behind the billionaire's armor. On a Thursday afternoon, while the city below was swallowed by a thick coastal fog, I wandered into the west wing of the apartment. I had avoided this area entirely, knowing it housed his private study. But the door was slightly ajar, and a strange, compelling curiosity pulled me across the threshold. The study was a sprawling, intimidating room, paneled in dark, heavy mahogany. It smelled of aged leather, expensive ink, and the sterile coldness of the glass windows. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, packed with thick, imposing volumes on global economics, contract law, and corporate strategy. The massive desk in the center of the room was a monument to his power, completely bare save for a single, sleek laptop and a stack of heavily redacted financial ledgers. It was a room built for a conqueror, designed to intimidate anyone who dared to enter. But tucked away in the far corner, almost entirely hidden in the shadow of a massive bookshelf, was a small, delicate writing desk. It was an antique piece, crafted from lighter wood, its elegant, curved legs completely out of place in this fortress of sharp angles and modern steel. It looked forgotten, a relic from a different era, deliberately pushed to the margins of his empire. I approached it slowly, running my fingertips over the smooth, dust-free surface. There was a small drawer set into the center. I hesitated. Invading his privacy was a dangerous line to cross. But the desk felt terribly lonely, radiating a quiet sorrow that called to the artisan in me. I gripped the small brass handle and pulled. The drawer stuck for a moment, the old wood swollen from the coastal humidity, before giving way with a soft, scraping sound. Inside lay a single object. It was a book, slightly smaller than a standard novel, bound in dark leather. But what caught my eye was the protective cloth cover slipped over the binding. It was frayed at the edges, the fabric worn soft by years of desperate handling. I reached into the drawer and lifted it out. The aged paper smelled faintly of dried lavender and old ink, a ghost of a scent that instantly made my chest tight. I opened the cover. The handwriting inside was incredibly elegant, but erratic. The looping cursive letters slanting sharply across the pages, as if the writer was constantly running out of time. At the top of the first page, a name was written in bold, faded ink: Helena Sterling. His mother. I had heard whispers of the late matriarch from Martha Finch. Helena had been a woman of supposedly legendary grace, a high society fixture who had tragically passed away when Julian was only a teenager. The media had painted her life as a fairy tale of endless wealth and flawless elegance, the perfect wife to a powerful dynasty. I gently turned the fragile pages, feeling like a trespasser in a sacred space. The entries were not records of glamorous galas or philanthropic triumphs. They were quiet, desperate confessions. They were the frantic thoughts of a woman slowly suffocating in a vacuum of sterile luxury. I stopped on a page dated nearly 2 decades ago, my eyes catching on a specific paragraph where the ink had pooled heavily, as if she had pressed the pen down with tremendous force. Victoria brought the new necklace today. It is flawless, of course. $1 million of compressed carbon meant to sit perfectly against my collarbone for the gala tomorrow night. They call it a gift. They call it a symbol of the Sterling family's enduring prosperity. But, as he clasped it around my neck, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I could not breathe. The metal is so incredibly cold. The diamonds do not reflect light. They swallow it. I am expected to smile, to be the beautiful, silent statue draped in their wealth, but they do not understand. These are not gifts. They are heavy, freezing chains. I am disappearing inside this house, buried alive under a mountain of beautiful, meaningless things. And no one can hear me screaming behind the glass. I stared at the faded ink, my breath catching in my throat. The words blurred as a sudden, unexpected wave of profound empathy crashed over me. Helena had not been a queen in this castle. She had been a prisoner. She had felt the exact same crushing, transactional weight of the Sterling family's wealth that I had felt the moment I stepped into this penthouse. She had been collateral in a different kind of ledger, a beautiful asset meant to secure their social optics, slowly drowning in the cold, unyielding pressure of high society expectations. I looked up from the pages, my eyes scanning the massive, sterile study. The room suddenly looked entirely different. I thought of Julian, the stoic, impenetrable man who wore a frayed coat because it was the only thing that felt real. He had grown up in this environment. He had watched his mother slowly fade into a silent, glittering ghost, trapped by the very wealth he now wielded like a weapon. His coldness was not inherently cruel. It was a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. He built his walls out of winter stone because the alternative was to be crushed by the expectations of his lineage, just as she had been. I closed Helena's leather journal, my hands trembling slightly. I did not belong in this world, but in this quiet, dusty corner of the study, I had found a bridge. I understood the language of her grief, the desperate need to preserve a sense of self when everyone around you only saw a price tag. Without entirely thinking about the consequences, I carried the heavy journal out of the study and down the hall into my small guest room. I set it gently down on my desk, right beside my botanical embroidery kit. I sat in my sturdy oak chair, staring at the frayed cloth cover that protected her deepest secrets. I reached into my supplies and selected a spool of pale, delicate violet silk. It was a fragile color, the exact shade of early spring lavender. I threaded a tiny, exceptionally sharp needle. I picked up the journal, my fingers resting respectfully against the aged leather, and carefully pressed the steel point through the bottom right corner of the frayed cloth cover. I did not sew a grand, elaborate design. I did not want to overwrite her history or disrespect the sanctity of her words. I simply stitched a tiny, nearly invisible botanical bud into the worn fabric. It was a closed lavender bud, small and tightly woven, requiring extreme focus and the lightest of touches to execute without damaging the brittle cloth. It took me less than 10 minutes to finish. I smoothed my thumb over the tiny bump of violet silk. It was a secret marker, a silent signal across time. It was an artisan's vow of solidarity to a woman who had died feeling completely unseen. She was no longer just a ghost trapped in a drawer. She was acknowledged. I carried the journal back to the study, navigating the dim, quiet halls with a strange new sense of purpose. I placed the book exactly where I had found it, in the small, forgotten drawer of the antique desk, and pushed it closed. As I walked back to my room, the oppressive silence of the penthouse no longer felt like a weapon designed to isolate me. The air was still cold, the marble still unforgiving, and the debt Arthur had hung around my neck still completely unpaid. I had refused to become Julian's property, and I still refused his wealth, his credit cards, and the gilded cage he had offered me. But the transaction between us was no longer just a cold arrangement of numbers and legal signatures. It had become something entirely different, something rooted in the quiet, shared survival of the Sterling family's crushing legacy. The battle lines remained drawn, but the ground beneath them had fundamentally shifted. It had been 2 weeks since the night of the mended coat and the quiet discovery in the study. The fragile, unspoken truce between Julian and me held steady, a cautious equilibrium, built on mutual, silent observation rather than sudden declarations. But the outside world, the ruthless, glittering machine of the Sterling Empire, was not content to leave us in our isolated sanctuary indefinitely. The invitation to the annual Sterling family dinner arrived not as a polite request, but as a heavily embossed mandate delivered by a silent courier. It was to be held at an exclusive, members-only club in the heart of the Upper East Side, a gathering of the old money dynasties that dictated the financial pulse of the city. I knew exactly what my required presence there meant. I was to be presented, evaluated, and ruthlessly catalogued by his family. I was the living embodiment of a balanced ledger, the physical receipt of my brother's disastrous gambling debts brought into the light to satisfy their morbid curiosity. Julian had informed me of the dinner, with his usual clinical brevity, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while I brewed my morning chamomile. He had glanced briefly down the long hallway, a silent, heavy reminder of the dark garment bags still hanging untouched in the master closet. He did not issue a command to wear them, nor did he remind me of my contractual obligations to appear as a flawless society wife. But the weight of his world's expectations hung thick in the air between us. When the evening of the dinner finally arrived, I did not walk toward his wing of the penthouse. I stayed firmly within the boundaries of my small guest room. I opened my canvas duffel and carefully withdrew a dress I had spent months drafting and stitching by hand, long before Arthur's debts had ever threatened to swallow my life. It was a structured, high-necked, midnight blue crepe gown, deliberately devoid of any glittering embellishments, sequins, or sheer cutouts. Its beauty lay entirely in the obsessive, mathematical precision of the tailoring and the subtle, dark-on-dark botanical embroidery that climbed from the cuffs of the long sleeves up to the elbows. It was not a dress meant to display borrowed wealth. It was a garment engineered by my own hands to project an impenetrable, quiet dignity. I pinned my hair back firmly at the nape of my neck, applied nothing more than a simple, practical layer of cosmetics, and stepped out into the hallway. Julian was already waiting by the steel-paneled elevator. He wore a severe pitch-black tuxedo that absorbed the ambient light, making him look even more like a towering monolith of winter stone. When he turned his head to look at me, his dark eyes swept slowly over the heavy crepe, taking in the complete absence of the designer labels he had provided on our first day. He noted my bare neck, free of any borrowed diamonds, and my unadorned ears. For a fleeting, microscopic second, a shift altered the hard line of his jaw. Not a flare of anger, not a shadow of disapproval, but a sharp, intense flicker of something that looked dangerously like profound respect. He did not ask why I had refused his gifts yet again. He simply reached out and pressed the silver button to summon the elevator. The ride to the club was wrapped in the familiar, heavy silence that defined our arrangement, but the atmospheric pressure within the car had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the freezing, teeth-baring quiet of a hostage and her captor sitting in forced proximity. It was a shared, watchful stillness, a mutual bracing against the external world that sought to consume us both. The private dining room at the elite club was a suffocating cavern of old wealth and crushing heritage. The walls were paneled in dark, varnished mahogany and lined with heavy oil portraits of long-dead patriarchs, staring down with unforgiving eyes. An enormous, tiered crystal chandelier hung directly over a massive, polished dining table, casting a harsh, fragmented light over the assembled guests. The air was overwhelmingly thick, layered with the cloying scent of expensive, heavy perfumes, rich roasted meats, and the sharp metallic tang of ruthless corporate ambition. This was the exact environment that had slowly suffocated his mother, turning Helena into a silent ghost trapped behind glass. As Julian led me into the room, the low hum of conversation instantly died. Dozens of sharp, calculating eyes turned toward the heavy wooden doors, sweeping over my simple blue dress, my bare neck, and my quiet, unsmiling posture. I could practically hear the mental arithmetic, clicking behind their perfectly manicured smiles, weighing my worth against the scandalous rumors of my father's financial ruin and Arthur's dark ledgers. I did not shrink under the oppressive, physical weight of their collective judgment. I kept my spine perfectly straight, matching the cold, unyielding posture of the formidable man walking beside me. We took our assigned seats near the head of the long table. To my immediate right sat Victoria Sterling, Julian's aunt, and the undisputed, terrifying matriarch of the family's social hierarchy. She was draped in an elaborate, breathtakingly expensive couture gown, constructed of pale silver lace, her neck heavy with cascading, flawless diamonds that caught the chandelier's light like jagged shards of ice. She exuded a chilling, predatory elegance, her sharp, heavily lined eyes missing absolutely nothing as she observed my unadorned presence. The dinner progressed in a grueling, theatrical procession of endless courses and hollow calculated dialogue. Heavy silver cutlery clinked aggressively against fine bone china, the sound sharp and grating to my ears. The conversation swirling around the table was a language I fundamentally refused to speak. A rapid exchange of corporate mergers, offshore accounts, political leverage, and vicious, veiled insults masked as polite inquiries about summer estates. I remained entirely silent, eating very little, focusing my attention instead on the tactile, grounding sensation of the heavy linen napkin resting in my lap and the cold condensation gathering on the crystal stem of my water glass. Julian sat beside me like a shadow cast in solid iron, answering direct questions with absolute, minimal effort, his massive physical presence serving as a silent, unyielding barrier between me and the venom of the room. But Victoria was not a woman who allowed anomalies to exist unchallenged in her domain. As the porcelain plates for the fourth course were being efficiently cleared by the silent waitstaff, she turned her sharp, glittering gaze entirely onto me. The subtle hum of conversation around us immediately began to dip, the other guests sensing the impending strike like wolves, circling a wounded animal. "So, Clara," Victoria began. Her voice, a smooth, cultured purr that carried effortlessly across the polished wood, designed to ensure every person in the room heard her words. "I understand that Julian had to go to truly extraordinary lengths to resolve your brother's unfortunate financial entanglements. A rather massive gambling debt, was it not? How utterly exhausting for you to carry such a shameful family burden into our home." The table went dead silent. The insult was not veiled. It was a deliberate public execution of my pride, meant to remind me that I was nothing more than a purchase solution to a pathetic problem. Julian shifted slightly in his chair, the heavy muscles in his shoulders tensing under his dark tuxedo, his jaw locking into a dangerous line. But before he could issue the cold reprimand I knew was coming, Victoria pressed her perceived advantage. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her gaze dropping pointedly to my hands, resting quietly on the edge of the table. "And tell me, my dear, what exactly is it that you do to occupy your time? Julian mentioned you were an artisan of some sort. A seamstress?" She let the word roll off her tongue as if it were a contagious disease. She reached elegantly for her crystal wine glass, her own hands perfectly manicured, impossibly soft, and weighted with enormous emerald rings. "I suppose that fully explains your hands. It is quite startling to see a sterling bride with such rustic, unfortunate imperfections." I looked down at my hands. They were entirely bare of jewelry, stripped of any sparkling camouflage. The skin across my knuckles was slightly dry from the winter air, the tips of my index fingers heavily calloused and marked with tiny, faded scars from a decade of pushing steel needles through thick canvas and raw linen. They were the hands of a laborer, the hands of a woman who had worked until her eyes burned, in the dim light, to keep her mother comfortable and her family afloat. In this room of flawless, unearned, synthetic perfection, they were a glaring, unforgivable offense. I did not pull my hands off the edge of the table. I did not hide them in my lap, nor did I flush with the hot, frantic shame she was so desperately trying to force upon me. I slowly lifted my gaze, meeting Victoria's cold, triumphant eyes with absolute, unyielding calm. I reached out, my movement incredibly slow and deliberate, and gently touched the cuff of Victoria's pale silver sleeve. She flinched slightly at the unexpected contact, her eyes widening in shock, but I did not withdraw. My calloused fingertips traced the exact edge of the intricate, hand-stitched lace that adorned her wrist, feeling the familiar tension of the threads. "This is genuine Alençon lace, Victoria," I said, my voice quiet but clear and steady enough to echo in the dead silence of the dining room. "It is entirely handmade, not machine-stamped. The specific motif here, this dense floral spray, requires thousands of microscopic French knots and a heavily corded outline to give it this three-dimensional structure." I released her sleeve and calmly folded my own rough hands back together on the polished wood. "Do you know exactly, calloused, bleeding fingers it takes to construct your armor?" I asked, my tone utterly devoid of malice, delivering the reality of her world with the clinical precision of a historian. "The women who made your magnificent gowns sat in poorly lit rooms for hundreds of hours, their eyesight slowly failing, their skin cracking and bleeding onto the fabric, just so you could sit here tonight and feel infinitely superior to the rest of the world. My hands look exactly like this, because I know the absolute value of honest labor. I know the exact, painful cost of creating something beautiful out of nothing. You wear the physical cost of my world like a costume, Victoria, but you do not understand its weight." I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable truth of my words settle over the glittering crystal glasses and the silent, staring faces of the elite. My brother's desperate debts brought me to this table, yes, but I have earned every single callus on my skin. Can you say the exact same about the diamonds around your neck? A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled around the massive table. Victoria's face drained entirely of color, her mouth opening in sheer, offended shock, but no sound managed to escape her throat. The sheer audacity of a purchased asset, a collateral bride, politely and intellectually. Dismantling the terrifier of the Sterling dynasty, using the very fabric of her own dress, had completely paralyzed the room. The silence that followed was thick, dangerous, and absolute. I expected Julian to finally intercede on her behalf. I expected the ruthless billionaire to assert his dominance, to firmly silence the unruly woman who was publicly shaming his sacred lineage, to protect the sterile high society optics he had paid millions of dollars to secure. Instead, Julian moved. He did not raise his voice in anger. He did not pound his fist on the table or launch into a loud theatrical defense of his new wife. With slow, devastating deliberation, he reached across the small space between our chairs and placed his massive, bare hand directly over my calloused ones. The sudden warmth of his skin was a grounding, physical shock against the freezing hostility of the room. His grip was incredibly firm, absolute, and entirely protective, his thumb resting gently against my scarred knuckles. He did not look at me. His dark, lethal gaze was locked entirely on Victoria, his expression a terrifying, unreadable mask of winter stone. "Clara's hands," Julian said, his low, gravelly voice cutting through the thick silence like a steel blade, "hold a level of integrity and genuine worth that this family has not seen in 3 generations. Victoria bristled, her composure violently cracking, as a flush of dark red crept up her neck. "Julian, you cannot possibly allow her to speak to me in this." "I am speaking, Victoria," he interrupted, his tone so violently cold, it seemed to physically drop the ambient temperature in the room. He did not shout, but the sheer gravity of his quiet command forced her mouth shut instantly, trapping her words in her throat. "You will not speak of her brother's debt again. You will not question her craft, and you will not mock her labor. Her hands hold far more value than the entirety of your inherited stock portfolio and hollow trusts. She is my wife. She is my sovereign equal in every metric that actually matters in this world, and if anyone at this table finds her presence, or her hands, a salve." Julian slowly withdrew his hand from mine, the loss of his warmth immediate, and stood up from the table. His towering frame completely dominated the room, casting a long, intimidating shadow over the pristine white tablecloth and the frightened faces of his relatives. "Then we have absolutely nothing left to discuss," he finished, the finality in his voice ringing like a gavel. He did not ask for my permission to leave, nor did he wait for the stunned guests to formulate a cohesive response. He simply stepped behind my chair, placing his large hands lightly on the wooden backrest, and pulled it out for me. It was an unmistakable, deeply respectful invitation to depart a space that did not deserve us. I stood up, my spine rigid, my chin held high. I did not look back at Victoria's pale, furious face, nor did I glance at the whispering, shocked relatives who were suddenly avoiding my gaze. Julian signaled the head waitstaff with a single, sharp nod, and within seconds, my simple dark wool coat was brought to the heavy wooden doors of the dining room. He did not hand the garment to me to put on myself. In front of the entire assembly of judgmental billionaires, arrogant heirs, and silent society matrons, Julian Sterling, a man who commanded global markets and struck pure fear into corporate boards, stepped closely behind me, held the heavy wool open, and carefully helped me into my coat. He smoothed the dark shoulders down with a slow, deliberate care that was infinitely more powerful than any loud, dramatic declaration of love. It was a physical manifestation of his absolute devotion, a quiet, public yielding of his immense power, but designed solely to protect my dignity. We walked out of the private club and out into the freezing, rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us with a definitive click, instantly cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of the Sterling dynasty. The cold night air hit my face, smelling intensely of wet asphalt and city exhaust. A harsh but deeply welcome reality after the sterile venom of the dining room. Julian's private driver was already waiting by the curb, the sleek black car idling quietly in the rain. Julian opened the heavy door for me, his large hand hovering just inches from the small of my back, a silent, unyielding guard, ensuring my safe passage from the curb to the vehicle. I slipped into the warm, dark leather interior, and he immediately followed, shutting the door heavily behind us and sealing us inside a quiet, moving sanctuary. The city lights blurred rapidly past the tinted windows, painting fleeting, abstract streaks of gold and deep red across the dark interior of the car. We sat in total silence for a very long time. The sharp adrenaline that had kept my spine steel rigid during the dinner was slowly beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, exhausting ache in my muscles and a strange hollowness in my chest. I stared down at my hands, resting loosely in my lap. The dry calluses were still there. The faint silver scars remained. But for the very first time since Arthur had signed my life away on a cold ledger, they did not feel like heavy markers of my burden. They felt like undeniable badges of my survival. I turned my head slightly, looking at Julian through the shadows. He was staring out the opposite window, his jaw finally relaxed. The brutal, predatory tension that usually defined his posture in public completely dissolved. He had just severed a vital, lifelong social tie to defend me. He had publicly and ruthlessly rejected the very world that had suffocated his mother, choosing my quiet, stubborn dignity over his family's glittering, conditional approval. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, breaking the heavy quiet of the leather-scented car. "I am entirely used to defending my own work." Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. The ambient light from the passing street lamps caught the sharp, aggressive angles of his face, softening the winter stone into something startlingly human and deeply weary. His dark eyes dropped to my hands, tracing the shape of my fingers in the gloom before lifting back up to hold my gaze steadily. "I know you are," he replied, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated in the small space. "But you shouldn't have to. Not in my presence. Not ever again." He didn't say anything else. He didn't offer a grand, theatrical apology for his family's abhorrent behavior, nor did he attempt to bridge the remaining physical distance between us on the wide leather seat. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. He simply rested his arm on the center console, leaving this space between us open, safe, and entirely devoid of the transactional weight that had originally brought us together. I looked back out the rain-streaked window, watching the heavy droplets race across the glass. The penthouse was still waiting for us at the end of the drive, a sprawling, intimidating vault of cold marble and high-end security. But as the car glided smoothly through the dark, sleeping city, the fundamental concept of home began to shift rapidly in my mind. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. And for the first time since my father's debts had destroyed my life, as I breathed in the faint, grounding scent of cedarwood and winter rain, radiating from the stoic man beside me, I realized I was no longer afraid of where we were going. The morning after the Sterling family dinner did not arrive with a dramatic flourish or a sudden, cinematic revelation. It came quietly, creeping through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panes of the penthouse, in pale, hesitant shades of winter gray. I lay awake in my small guest room long before the city below began to stir, listening to the absolute, unbroken silence of the sprawling estate. The events of the previous evening replayed in my mind, the crushing hostility of the dining room, the sharp, victorious sting of defending my craft, and the heavy, shocking warmth of Julian's hand, covering mine in front of his entire dynasty. He had chosen my dignity over his family's approval. He had publicly severed a lifelong tie to protect me from the venom of his world. It was an act of profound, silent devotion that had fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure between us. But as the pale light slowly illuminated the sterile white walls of my claimed sanctuary, a deeper, undeniable truth settled into my bones. Respect had been established. A bridge of understanding had been built over the cold marble floors. But the foundation of our entire existence was still rooted in a poisoned soil. I was still here because of a signature on a corporate ledger. I was still legally bound by a massive debt that my brother Arthur had recklessly accumulated. The towering billionaire had defended me as his sovereign equal, but true equality cannot exist within the parameters of a financial transaction. A bird is not free simply because its captor decides to leave the cage door open. It is only free when it builds its own nest in the wild branches of a tree it chose itself. If the stoic man asleep in the opposite wing, and I were ever to discover what existed in the quiet spaces between us, I had to completely dismantle the transactional nature of our arrangement. I had to reclaim my autonomy not just in spirit, but in absolute, undeniable reality. I pushed the heavy duvet aside and stood up. The marble floor was freezing against my bare feet, a sharp physical reminder of the world I was about to leave behind. Moving with slow, methodical purpose, I retrieved my canvas duffel bag from the closet. I did not touch the dark, opaque garment bags holding the designer wardrobe he had provided. They hung there like hollow, headless ghosts of a high society wife I completely refused to become. I packed only what belonged to me. I folded my simple cotton sweaters, my faded denim, and the heavy midnight blue crepe gown I had worn the night before, smoothing the fabric with my calloused hands. Next, I knelt on the rug and carefully organized my botanical embroidery kit. Every spool of silk thread was placed precisely into its designated slot. The deep forest greens, the vibrant lavenders, the stark midnight blues. I secured the tiny, lethal steel needles in their velvet cushion. This kit was my true ledger, the only instrument capable of generating a wealth I actually valued. I zipped the canvas bag shut. Then came the heaviest burdens. I knelt beside the heavy sewing machine, gripped its cold, metallic base, and lifted it. My shoulder muscles burned instantly under the tremendous weight, the familiar ache radiating down my spine, but I welcomed the pain. It was the physical cost of my independence. I carried it out into the long, shadowed hallway, setting it down gently near the steel-paneled elevator. I returned to my room for the final piece of my identity, that cherished oak seat. The hand-carved oak was smooth beneath my palms, carrying the invisible history of my mother's struggles and my own countless nights of labor. I carried it out to join the iron machine. Before I summoned the elevator, I walked back through the quiet corridor toward the massive, open-concept kitchen. The polished gray-veined island stretched out in the dim light, a sterile altar of untouchable wealth. I reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and withdrew a small, frayed leather coin purse. During my entire stay in this gilded vault, I had refused his credit cards, his food, his staff, and his luxury. But there was one microscopic fraction of his wealth I had consumed. Every morning, I had brewed a single cup of tea using his supplies. I had mentally calculated the exact market value of the premium loose-leaf chamomile and dried peppermint I had steeped in my chipped wooden mug over the past few weeks. It was not a significant sum to a man who bought and sold international shipping conglomerates before breakfast, but to me, it represented the final, lingering thread of my indebtedness. I opened the clasp of the coin purse. I extracted 3 crumpled, faded, $1 bills and 2 silver quarters. I smoothed the wrinkled paper money out flat against the freezing, flawless surface of the marble island, aligning the edges with obsessive precision. Then, I placed the 2 heavy coins directly in the center of the bills. The sharp, metallic clink echoed loudly in the cavernous, empty kitchen, a sound of absolute, finalized accounting, exactly $3.50. The ledger was now completely wiped clean. I owed Julian Sterling absolutely nothing. I was walking out of his empire exactly as I had entered it, a proud, unyielding artisan with calloused hands and an unbroken soul. I did not leave a dramatic, tear-stained letter of explanation. I did not wait for him to wake up so I could deliver a cinematic farewell speech. I simply turned my back on the money, walked to the elevator, and pressed the heavy silver button. The doors slid shut, sealing the penthouse away in silence. The journey away from Manhattan was a slow, rattling transition from the suffocating grip of concrete canyons to the wild, untamed expanse of the Atlantic coast. I took a northbound train, watching the gray skyscrapers dissolve into sprawling pine forests and rocky shorelines. Martha Finch, the kind, elderly shopkeeper who had quietly purchased my botanical pieces to help me survive, had recently relocated her own independent business to a small, sleepy coastal town. During one of our brief phone calls, she had mentioned a vacant, dilapidated storefront immediately adjacent to hers, sitting empty just a few blocks from the harbor. It was cheap, ignored by commercial developers, and entirely perfect. When I finally arrived, the coastal air hit my lungs like a shock of freezing water. It smelled intensely of raw sea salt, drying kelp, and old, weathered wood. The sky above was a vast, bruised canvas of heavy purple and slate gray clouds, promising an incoming storm. I dragged my heavy iron machine and the oak seat down the uneven cobblestone sidewalk until I reached the small, dusty window of the vacant shop. Martha was waiting for me, holding a brass key and a warm cup of coffee. She didn't ask probing questions about the billionaire I had left behind. She simply unlocked the door, handed me a broom, and welcomed me to reality. For the next several days, I threw myself entirely into the brutal, exhausting physical labor of reclaiming my space. I scrubbed the ancient floorboards on my hands and knees until the water in the bucket turned black, erasing years of neglect. I polished the large front window until the glass was invisible, allowing the pale coastal light to flood the small room. I set my sewing machine on a sturdy wooden counter, facing the street, and I placed my wooden chair right behind it. I arranged my embroidery hoops along the walls, displaying the intricate ferns, the delicate lavender sprigs, and the deep green vines I had stitched during my isolation in the city. This shop was incredibly small. The roof rattled aggressively when the coastal winds howled off the ocean, and the floorboards creaked under every step. There was no climate-controlled perfection, no invisible security staff, and absolutely no marble. But as I sat down in my chair on the fourth morning, threading a needle with vibrant green silk, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over me. The air smelled of lemon soap, raw linen, and sea spray. I was entirely alone, completely unmoored from the Sterling dynasty, and for the very first time in my adult life, my future belonged exclusively to my own hands. 2 full weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of the coastal sanctuary. The days blurred together in a comforting, predictable cycle of needlework, hot tea, and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves against the harbor breakwater. I survived entirely on the modest sales of my custom pieces, proving to myself with every transaction that my hands were capable of sustaining my life. The deep, lingering ache in my chest, a strange, heavy hollow left behind by the absence of a certain stoic, towering presence, was something I fiercely ignored, burying it beneath the meticulous, mathematical precision of my embroidery patterns. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon, when the atmosphere in the small shop suddenly shifted. A heavy, violent squall was rolling in off the ocean, turning the sky a deep, bruised charcoal and sending violent gusts of wind rattling against the large front window pane. The ambient light in the room dropped significantly, forcing me to lean closer to my fabric. I was in the middle of a highly complex fern motif, my fingers aching with cold, when my elbow accidentally knocked against the edge of the wooden work table. A single spool of vibrant, botanical green silk thread rolled off the edge. It hit the floorboards with a soft, hollow thud and rolled rapidly across the uneven wood, disappearing toward the front entrance of the shop. I sighed, setting my needle down, and pushed my seat back to retrieve it. But before I could stand, the small brass bell mounted above the shop door chimed, a sharp, frantic sound as the heavy wooden door was pushed open against the howling coastal wind. The storm rushed into the room, bringing a violent swirl of cold air, damp leaves, and the overwhelming scent of raw sea salt. But instantly, cutting through the sharp brine of the ocean, came a deep, rich, completely unmistakable fragrance: cedarwood, winter rain, and the faint metallic tang of cold city steel. I froze halfway out of my chair, my breath catching violently in my throat. Julian stepped into the small, dusty shop. He pushed the heavy door shut behind him, sealing the howling storm outside, and the sudden quiet in the room was deafening. He was entirely stripped of his corporate armor. The immaculate, pitch-black tuxedos and razor-sharp suits were gone. Instead, he wore a thick, dark sweater and the familiar, heavy, worn wool coat, the exact garment I had mended in the dead of night. His dark hair was damp and disordered from the wind, and the usual impenetrable, predatory mask of winter stone he wore for the world had completely shattered. He looked exhausted. He looked stripped down to his very core, standing in my humble sanctuary, like a man who had walked through 1,000 miles of wreckage, just to find a single, glowing ember. He did not immediately look at me. His dark, weary eyes tracked the floorboards until they locked onto the small spool of green thread that had rolled near the toe of his wet leather boot. The man who controlled global markets, the ruthless tycoon who could bankrupt entire corporations with a single phone call, took a slow step forward. Then, in the center of my dusty, creaking shop, he lowered his massive frame and dropped entirely down onto one knee. It was not a grand, theatrical proposal. It was an act of profound, startling humility. He reached out with his large, bare hand and gently picked up the tiny, wooden spool of silk. His long fingers, accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar acquisitions, cradled the fragile thread as if it were the most valuable object on earth. He remained kneeling on the hard wood for a long, heavy moment, the wet fabric of his coat pooling around him, before he slowly pushed himself back to his feet and walked toward my work table. He stopped just a few feet away, the physical space between us vibrating with the immense, unspoken gravity of the past 2 weeks. He reached out and gently placed the spool down on the wooden surface, right next to my scattered needles. Then, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a thick, folded envelope. He laid it flat on the table, right over my raw linen fabric. "I found the $3.50 on the marble," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded incredibly raw, as if he hadn't spoken a single word since the morning he found my empty room. "Your calculations were ruthlessly accurate, but the ledger was fundamentally flawed from the beginning." He nudged the envelope slightly toward me. The flap was open, revealing the thick legal parchment inside. "That is the original contract," he continued, his dark eyes finally lifting to meet mine, entirely devoid of leverage or command, "and the absolute totality of your brother's debts. It is entirely voided. The signatures have been legally annulled. The debt is erased, Clara, not because you paid for it with your presence, but because it was a grotesque violation of your autonomy to ever use you as collateral in the first place." I stared at the thick white envelope resting on my work table. The suffocating chains that had dragged me into his world, the heavy financial anchors that had threatened to drown my family name, were sitting right in front of me, rendered completely powerless. I looked up at his face, searching for the hidden trap, the corporate angle, the expectation of gratitude. But there was absolutely nothing but raw, bleeding honesty in his gaze. "I did not come here to demand you return to the penthouse," he said, his voice dropping to a quiet, steady murmur that barely competed with the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. "I know how suffocating the sterling name is. I watched it slowly destroy my mother behind those glass walls. And the moment you left your coins on the island, I realized I was using the exact same transactional poison to try and keep you. I bought a signature because I did not know how to earn a person." He stepped slightly closer, his massive presence radiating a deeply grounding warmth against the freezing draft of the shop. "You refused my wealth. You refused to become my property. You walked out into the rain and built an empire out of silk thread and raw linen, and it is the most magnificent thing I have ever witnessed. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there." I swallowed hard, the tight, defensive knot that had lived in my chest for months suddenly dissolving, leaving me feeling entirely unmoored, yet perfectly safe. I looked at his hands, resting openly at his sides, completely empty of leverage. "If the debt is voided," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly in the quiet room, "then why are you here, Julian?" He looked around the small, dusty shop. He looked at the rustic wooden shelves, the chipped paint on the window frame, and finally, his gaze settled on the simple wooden chair sitting in the corner, the one I used when my back ached from leaning over the machine. "Because the penthouse is completely silent again," he answered softly, "and because I don't want to live in a vault anymore." He looked back at me, the towering, stoic protector entirely surrendering his pride, placing heart bare on the wooden table. "I have no right to ask you for anything, but I am asking if I can simply stay. I don't want to buy your time. I just want to know if I can occupy that small chair in the corner. And maybe read a book while you work. I just want to exist in your space on your exact terms, as an equal." The silence in the room stretched out, no longer holding teeth, no longer a weapon of isolation. It was the quiet, peaceful stillness of a held breath finally being released. I looked at the man who had terrified me, the man who had silently adjusted my sewing lamp, defended my calloused hands, and had now tracked me through a coastal storm just to kneel on a dusty floor and ask for a corner of my world. I reached out, my calloused fingers brushing against the heavy, voided debt contract, before sliding past it to gently touch the fraying, mended cuff of his wet wool coat. "The roof leaks when the wind blows from the east," I said quietly, a small, fragile smile finally breaking across my face. "And there is absolutely no marble in this room." Julian's broad shoulders dropped, a profound, shuddering exhale of relief escaping his chest. The winter stone completely thawed, replaced by a warm, devastatingly beautiful vulnerability. He reached up, his large hand gently covering mine where it rested against his coat. "I despise marble," he whispered. We didn't need a grand, dramatic embrace, nor did we need a loud declaration of undeniable passion. The man who once offered me a contract now simply pulled my worn wooden chair closer to my table, sat down, and quietly watched me thread my needle. And every now and then, when the coastal storm raged outside, he would get up and silently brew 2 cups of hot chamomile tea. People ask sometimes how a transaction becomes a true partnership. I don't know if I have a perfect answer. All I know is this: we left the grand house behind, finding that home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. I don't need a ring. I don't need a ceremony. I just need him here every day sitting beside me, even in silence. That's what I call forever. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.